Throughout the years on this channel, we have covered hundreds of missing persons cases, spanning from being somewhat unusual to absolutely bizarre. Each of these incidents involved puzzling aspects that left both search parties and law enforcement baffled, unable to provide a definitive answer as to what happened. This is going to be a long one, so grab a hot drink and let's begin. Todd William Hofflander was 39 years old when he disappeared in Hell's Canyon, located in the Windy Saddle area of Idaho County. At this time, Todd had been helping his friends scout mule deer bucks between Windy Saddle and McAfee Cabin. On the day of Todd's disappearance, the 27th of September 2010, he wasn't alone that day and was spending time with his friends. However, they planned to separate and take different paths through Hell's Canyon to meet up again at Snake River. We'll come back to this point shortly. It was during this point of separation that something went awry for Todd. While his friends would reach Snake River, Todd would never be seen again. Even at this stage, Todd wasn't completely alone. Ruby, his black Labrador retriever, was with him the entire time. The group planned to meet up the day afterwards on the 28th, and this is of course when they came to the realization that Todd had gone missing. They knew the general route that Todd took, and they backtracked to see if they could find any sign of him or Ruby. They couldn't. After the failed search by the friends, they contacted the authorities and the real search effort began. Aerial grid searches were made by helicopters equipped with thermal imaging technology, alongside the many ground searchers with dogs present. The search didn't result in Todd being found, but a couple of days into the search, Ruby was located. She was found by searchers near milepost 15 on 7 Devils Road, south of Riggins. This was the opposite side of the 7 Devils mountain range where Todd was last seen. The searchers did try to have Ruby lead them to Todd, but sadly she wasn't able to. The surrounding areas to which Ruby was discovered were searched thoroughly multiple times, but again, they couldn't locate Todd. A post was made on a forum by the user New Boots of Idaho. This is the woman who found Ruby with her husband. I quote, "My husband and I were the ones who found Ruby on Friday. We stopped for lunch at a parking area for hunters about mile 15. We did see where she came from. She came downhill and sat near the fence and cattle guard growling at us, whining and pacing. We had our mini dachshund with us. She was obviously scared. Another group of photographers pulled up in a truck. They had dog food, water and dishes, and when we put them down and called her again, she came bounding, tail between her legs, but happy. We petted her and asked her, 'Where's Todd?' She became very excited and danced all around. We called out many times for Todd, and later my husband and I explored the area a bit more, but to no avail. We were not equipped for a detailed search." The area was shortly thereafter thoroughly searched, but Todd wasn't found. Now later, we find out why the group separated. Todd's wife would reveal at the time Todd had injured his knee and was going to take an easier route down to Snake River. It's not clear if all members of the group were alone or had split into smaller groups, but Todd was alone. In hindsight, this was not a good idea, and actually, even with foresight, it is probably not a good idea to have the injured person travel alone. Leaving that can of worms unopened, let's move to April 2020, around 10 years after this incident. Todd's remains would be undiscovered until this time, where a hunter found a skull above Bernard Creek. The hunter would then go on to find a pack containing camping gear and a camera. These items would be proven as belonging to Todd, and the remains would be positively identified as belonging to Todd too, though they weren't identified until January of 2021. So I suppose in the end, the question becomes, what actually happened here? Did Todd reach a situation in which his injury caused him to succumb? Or did something else happen? How did he actually end up so far from the rest of the group? Did he just get lost? How did he and Ruby get separated, Or did she leave after Todd had passed away? It seems that these questions will never be fully understood. John Glasgow, who was 45 years old when he disappeared from Petit State Park. John was a highly successful and intelligent man and had become the chief financial officer and vice president for CDI contractors. Reading about John, it seems that he was a very reliable person, obviously had a good work ethic, and was otherwise well thought of. John was a family man and lived in Little Rock, Arkansas with his wife Melinda, and the time leading up to his disappearance was relatively normal. On the 26th and 27th of January 2008, John spent much of that weekend at the office and then spent time with Melinda at a dinner party on the Sunday evening. John fell asleep downstairs that night in front of the TV, and when he awoke, something seemingly unusual and out of the ordinary would happen on the 28th of January, as this is the final time he would ever be seen. That morning, a neighbour saw him driving at around 5:15 AM in the direction that would take him to the office. However, he would never actually arrive, nor would he ever be seen again. It seems that Melinda wasn't worried initially, but she received a phone call at 2:30 PM from one of John's co-workers. The co-worker asked what was wrong because he hadn't arrived. This, of course, was completely out of character and was the moment that she began to realise that something wasn't quite right here. John's brother stated that leaving at 5:15 AM that morning was strange because this was too early for him to be leaving for work. A little later that afternoon, Melinda notified the authorities because no one had heard from him. Later the same day, an officer arrived at their residence and an official missing persons report was made. The following day would see a search effort put together, as when his phone was pinged, it led them to Petit State Park. His vehicle was found by an employee next to the Mather Lodge, but John himself was nowhere to be seen and all of his belongings were still in the car. After this discovery was made, the state park put a rescue team together and the search would last for 5 days. Cadaver dogs were brought in and a planned grid search took place. It seems that initially, the dogs may have followed John's scent to seed a trail, but at some point down the trail, the dogs came to a standstill, stopped, and couldn't follow it any further. Interestingly, they found no further clues as to John's direction of travel. After the dogs stopped, there was just nothing. John hadn't left any footprints behind, leading the rescuers to have to shift their focus to the surrounding areas because nothing was being found. Needless to say, but none of these efforts made a difference and John had effectively vanished from radar. That is, at least, until 7 years later. John's remains were found by a hiker on the 11th of March 2015. Multiple sources state that the remains were found in a well-trafficked hiking area at the base of Petit Mountain, and this was around a mile away from the car. Others state that the area was rugged and remote. I suppose both of those things can be true, but the way that they're presented in the articles seemed a little contradictory. In any case, the Conway County Sheriff, Mike Smith, stated, "We found the bones inside the clothing. Other parts were found in the area, strewn by animals. We are pretty sure we located nearly everything. We did find the bulk of the remains." The remains were found within a mile of where Glasgow's vehicle was last seen parked at the time of his disappearance. That mile, however, is as the crow flies and includes lengthy, boulder-laden steep trails. The hiker actually only found the skull. The rest of the body, including pieces of identification, were found around 200 yards south of the skull, on a rock within the clothing, while other pieces were scattered around. If this is in fact a popular hiking spot, then it's interesting it took so long to be uncovered. John's remains were then analysed and an official cause of passing couldn't be determined, and this created two camps of people. One side believes that something happened to John that morning in terms of some kind of third-party involvement, while others believe this may have been intentional. In the build-up to this incident, John's workplace was being externally audited, and this was something that increased his workload. Apparently, he had a number of unsavoury conversations with the auditors who believed he may have overcharged a number of times. But forensic law enforcement officers would later comb through this data and stated the books were completely clean and praised John's work. saying that he was highly organised and had everything in good standing. It's not really clear if this additional stress was a potential cause or not. It certainly could be true that the extra stress led John out there to go for a hike and get some fresh air that morning before heading to work. It is, of course, all speculation at this point, but John's brother seems to believe that something wasn't quite right here and that a third party may have been involved. What's interesting too is that the sheriff himself wasn't quite sure what to think. "We have mixed emotions about it," said Conway County Sheriff Mike Smith. "We were hoping for something more substantial for the family in the cause of passing. It is what it is though. We have to see where we go from here." Sheriff Smith is referring to the fact that a cause couldn't be determined. This means that there were no obvious injuries to indicate a fall, trauma, harm, or anything of that nature. Just to be clear too, as this hasn't been mentioned yet, but John was very familiar with this area, so it's not as though going to the park was a random decision. There is a chance it was spontaneous though. Ultimately, that's about all of the information I could find on John's disappearance, and it seems unlikely that we'll ever really know what happened to him that morning. He knew the area, so it's unlikely that he simply got lost. He had gathered his work equipment ready in the car that morning. He had no injuries to speak of, which unfortunately leaves us with far more questions than it does answers. Evangeline Lorimer was 21 years old when she disappeared inside the Great Smoky Mountains National Park on the 8th of June, 1951. The first time I heard about Evangeline was from the Hamilton Daily News Journal, who reported this 3 days later on the 11th of June, 1951. 70 rangers and volunteers combed the bear-infested section of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park today, searching for a Cincinnati girl missing since Friday. Evangeline and her father had been camping in the west central portion of the park, which lies astride the border of Tennessee and North Carolina. She went hiking alone last Friday afternoon, her father told rangers, and hasn't been seen since. "We've turned up only one clue since she was reported missing. We found a topcoat she had been wearing yesterday on a mountain about 5 miles from her camp." So in other words, Evangeline separated from her father that day and decided to go on her own hike, but something at some point clearly went awry. Also of interest to note is the fact that when the coat was found, the searchers stated it was hanging from a tree branch when they found it. The moment they found the coat hanging this way, they immediately called in bloodhound units with the obvious hope that the dogs would now be able to track her scent, except they couldn't. The dogs weren't able to track her scent at all and never made any indications of which direction she might have gone in relation to the coat. I'm sure this only served to further puzzle the searchers, but in any case, there were no further updates until 11 days later. The Washington DC Evening Star reported that Evangeline had been found and made mention that her situation had confused those searching for her. She seemed to have been in better condition than she should have been, and some elements didn't quite seem to make sense. Let's have a look. Evangeline walked out of the mountain wilderness in apparent good condition last night and told rangers she had spent 2 weeks wandering without food or protection. The nurse was taken to a hospital at nearby Saraville for observation, but rangers said she was suffering mainly from puffed feet and insect bites. They said she showed no signs of malnutrition. This is interesting. You'd certainly think that going without food for that long would show some clear signs. Of course, you can certainly go for that length of time without food, but it's surprising that there were no signs of malnutrition or anything like that. I enjoy the odd 24-hour fasting sessions every so often, but I couldn't imagine how you must feel after 2 whole weeks. Robert White, acting superintendent of the Smoky Mountains National Park, said she apparently was only half lost during the period when search parties were plodding over rugged terrain. He quoted her as saying she had heard them but didn't have the energy to respond. Okay, so some seemingly contradictory information there. It is mentioned in a number of articles that she was found in a state of confusion or a dazed state, so you simultaneously have no energy but aren't showing signs of malnutrition. Also, I'm not sure what the context of being half lost means here, because it seems to me that if this had gone on for much longer, she probably wouldn't have still been with us. She sounded pretty lost to me. Anyway, let's have a look at the moment of discovery. She was located on a little trail winding through laurel thickets in the general area where she disappeared. She told rangers she had decided it was time to come out. I'm so confused. Does this mean that she was hiding, or is this just delirious thinking now? I'm not sure. An unidentified mountain boy spotted her on Hannah Mountain last night and escorted her to a warden station. She was about 10 miles from her campsite, but she said she had only seen one bear. She told rangers she took a wrong turn after she left the camp for a short hike and got involved in one of the canyons. The ranger said her story was confused, but he delayed pressing questions upon her until after the doctors gave approval. Her account was that she saw no human being during her walk. She braved the fastness in a t-shirt, jeans and low white shoes. She had no coat nor blankets to protect her from the torrential rains that fell during the period of the cool mountain nights. Even after she returned, they, the searchers, marvelled that she could spend 2 weeks in an area alone, without food or means of protection against the wildlife and weather. That's all the information I could find about Evangeline. It was a pretty remarkable survival incident, and it's a shame we didn't really get any answers as to what she was doing or what her time in the wilderness looked like. It's odd that she hadn't eaten for 2 weeks but didn't show any signs of that according to the articles. In the end, I agree with the ranger's assessment that this was a strange and confused set of circumstances as to how the incident unfolded. Why did she hang her coat from a tree branch? It doesn't appear she had suffered from hypothermia, and there was rain with cold nights, so who knows what happened there. Anyway, given that there doesn't seem to be any further information to explore, let's move on to the next disappearance. Carolyn Peterson was just shy of 2 years old when this occurred in August of 1947. This took place in a rather rural area surrounded by farmlands. Specifically, Carolyn disappeared from her home in Ohio along State Route 96 near Waldo. At 10 AM on the 20th of August 1947, Carolyn was in the garden playing with her 3-year-old brother, unfortunately unsupervised. When Mrs. Peterson realised that she was missing 30 minutes later, she called the authorities. A search by 35 persons with the aid of 2 airplanes brought no results within a mile radius of the home. And Wednesday night, authorities had but 2 clues to the girl's disappearance. One was the aluminum top of a coffee pot used as a plaything by the child. The other was the story of her 3-year-old brother, who told of a yellow car stopping on the highway across the road from the house, and of a man getting out and sitting down in the grass. Now, I know what you're thinking. This is a clear-cut case of someone taking her, and I thought the exact same thing at this stage, and I almost stopped and moved on from this. But I urge you to stick with it for a moment, as things get a bit unexpected soon. The coffee pot was found around 160 yards from the garden, or 500 feet, meaning that Carolyn had wandered out of the garden. Now, it's not clear what this may have looked like. Did she simply get distracted and walk out? Was someone enticing her away? Or had she just been taken already and dropped the coffee pot? It's not clear, but let's keep going. Sheriff Retterer said he was not counting heavily upon the boy's story of the car. He said the child could not tell which way the machine was headed. Mrs. Peterson said her daughter was wearing a bright orange playsuit and brown shoes. While the sheriff didn't think much of the boy's story about the car, he changed his mind the day afterwards. Mostly because the search grew rapidly and there were many people present in this area, conducting grid searches, and it became apparent that she simply wasn't there. We're talking about a person that is less than 2 years old and really shouldn't have been able to get very far alone. Belief mounted today that Carolyn had been taken from her home near Waldo, 10 miles south of Marion, as a continuing search for the blonde, curly-haired child unearthed no further trace of her. The sheriff first indicated doubt of the 3-year-old brother's story of seeing a yellow automobile across the road, but later attached more importance to the boy's story. The article emphasised efforts made by the searchers to basically de-strip the areas of vegetation so that they could see more clearly, but even so, they never found any trace of her. Okay, let's get bizarre now. Just to reinforce this point again, this was an extensive search and the entire area had been searched and researched many times by a growing number of people, over 100 at times. This is a very young girl who really shouldn't have been able to get very far and you'd like to think wouldn't have been missed. Now, let's have a look at the East Liverpool Review, who reported this on the 23rd of August 1947. There isn't a single bit of evidence which promises at the moment to lead to the girl's recovery. Authorities admit at least a temporary stalemate. They even conducted a second search yesterday of the nearby banks of the Olentangy River because a fortune teller informed the distraught father that his baby would be found safe there. I thought it was important to report that before we move on to the next day, the 24th, where this was reported by the Athens Sunday Messenger. Carolyn Peterson was found alive Saturday after having been missing from her home since Wednesday, the State Highway reported. The girl, who had been feared to have been taken, was found in a briar patch about 1,000 feet, 300 yards, west of the farm home of her parents. She was taken to City Hospital here. Her condition was described as fair. Hospital attendants said she had suffered from exposure. The child was covered with dirt and had suffered numerous small scratches. A neighbour, Samuel Almendinger, found the little toddler about 7:05 p.m. in an area which had been gone over by as many as 100 searchers in the past 4 days. So where do you even start with that? Carolyn was found in an area that had been repeatedly searched previously. Based on her appearance and condition in terms of dirt and scratches, she certainly sounds like someone who had spent that duration outside. This led to the family, as well as the sheriff, to abandon the hypothesis that the third party in the supposed yellow car had taken her. This is interesting in and of itself. The boy sounded rather confused about the car in the first place. Was it a car, and did a man actually get out and sit in the grass? Who knows? Both the father and Sheriff Leroy Retterer said they were agreed that the baby had been wandering around in heavy undergrowth in the neighbourhood of the Peterson home the entire 80 hours she was absent. Previously, the father had expressed belief that it would have been virtually impossible for more than 100 searchers, aided by airplanes, to have missed finding the child in the area less than 1,000 feet from the Peterson home. The area had been covered repeatedly by the searchers. I think most people would be expressing that belief. She had suffered no injuries either, including no sunburns, so make of that what you will. Let's have a look at the moment of discovery. Samuel Almendinger, 75, a retired farmer whose property adjoins the Peterson home 2 miles north of Waldo, found the baby playing on a path through heavy undergrowth on the edge of his farm after he had gone to bring some cows from pasture. Almendinger said he got out of his car and went down a path he was accustomed to take in looking for the cows. I'd been down this same path looking for the baby on Thursday morning, but didn't see a thing. Then that made me think that she might be around, he said. Suddenly, he went on, he was alerted by a little noise. I looked down at the path and there she sat. She was right out in the open and it was easy to see her. I ran to her and picked her up in my arms and she tried to talk to me. Dr. Daniel Murphy described Carolyn as in very good shape for what she's gone through. She was conscious and crying when brought in. Her clothing was dirty and a shoe was missing. Because the area where the child was found had been thoroughly covered by searchers aided by airplanes, most people of the Waldo community expressed belief that Carolyn had been taken by a third party Wednesday morning and then returned to the vicinity of the home perhaps sometime Friday. The physicians indicated that the child had suffered about 24 hours exposure. I'm glad the whole idea of Carolyn being taken wasn't just given short shrift and moved on from, because it certainly seems to me that something wasn't quite right here. While her condition may have been consistent with her being outside for a time, it doesn't tell the whole story. If the doctors are certain that she had only suffered from approximately 24 hours worth of exposure, this almost certainly has to mean that she had shelter for a time. Now let's be honest, she didn't make that shelter herself, did she? So where did she go? Had she been taken and returned? By whom and why? I personally do lean in the direction that she wasn't in the area for the duration of the search, given what the doctors have stated. However, that perhaps doesn't explain everything, because other aspects seem to corroborate the idea that she'd spent the entire time out there. The physician said that the child lost no more than 5 to 7 pounds in the 80 hours she spent without food or water. Her temperature is normal. There's no further information after this, and we're left with a set of puzzling circumstances that seem to point in two separate directions. Was she there the entire time? If so, how did they miss her in all the previous searches? Or was it that she wasn't there the whole time? And if so, where did she go? What do you think happened here? Alice Lorraine Baker was just 20 months old when she disappeared in a Vermont woodland area. Specifically, she, her two siblings, and her parents lived in New York but were on holiday in Vermont, choosing to rent out a cabin near Bald Mountain. The specifics on the circumstances are a bit hazy, but it seems that the parents had managed to lose track of Alice. From what I can gather, Alice was playing in the garden with her other siblings, I think. The mother had just left on a 10-minute trip to get some milk from their neighbours, and I'm not sure where the father was, just inside the cabin, I think. It was during these 10 minutes that Alice would disappear. A large delegation of townspeople joined the search effort today for Alice Baker, who disappeared from the front lawn of her home here last night. Virtually, the entire town was out searching for the little girl, and 150 employees of the leading industrial plant here were excused from work and joined the search. Sheriff Peck is positive the child could not have been taken out of the area. More than 100 wary searchers poked through brush piles and plodded through dampy woods today in a fourth day's grim determined search for Alice. 3 days of unrelenting search have brought no trace of the tot, but Sheriff Peck insisted that she must be here somewhere. After checking all possibilities, she can't have been taken out of this locality. We are going right on with this hunt for the Baker child until every inch of land around here has been covered. The New York State Troopers brought in bloodhounds but said that the dogs never found a scent. It seems that hope was draining from this situation. Searchers virtually gave up hope today that Alice, missing since Monday, 4 days prior, would be found alive in nearby woods. Sheriff Peck said she could not possibly have survived the cold and exposure of the past 2 nights. We have considered the idea that she may have been taken and other possibilities, but we are convinced that she simply wandered into the woods. This is interesting in and of itself because this search grew rapidly and intensive grid searches were being undertaken all around the cabin for miles in every direction. The dogs never detected anything, and the searchers couldn't identify a direction of travel. It seems that the reason that they were so invested into the just wandering away hypothesis was because no one else had been seen around the cabin that day. There were no other vehicles present, and no one had seen anyone lingering around or anything like that. However, it seems that there were multiple camps here with differing ideas because some of the officers present found this incident to be highly unusual. Maybe Alice didn't wander away alone into the woods, said Constable Ralph Young. I'm afraid something else happened to her. It's important to note that Alice had been missing for 5 days at this point. We've heard differing opinions and ideas. Perhaps most prominently was the thought held by many present that a 20-month-old, or any young person really, could have survived this length of time alone in these harsh colds, especially overnight. So let's get bizarre. Alice Baker spent 5 days alone in Vermont woodland before being found. This is an experience that would have taxed the stamina of persons many times older than her, but doctors said today she should be well and playing again in a few days. It's worth noting right off the bat here that the doctors seen to her were stumped as to how she could have been missing for 5 days in this harsh area and have been in such good condition. Almost everyone believed that they were either looking for a body or that she just wasn't in the area anymore. The doctors said that she had a sore throat and many scratches. The search for Alice ended suddenly late yesterday when men who were hopefully following little footprints along a seldom used timber road between Bald and Spruce Mountains heard moans under a spruce tree about 30 yards away. Breaking through the underlying growth, they found Alice lying clothesless on her tiny one-piece blue sunsuit. So Alice disappeared for 5 days in terrain that was described as harsh in the woods. She was wearing only a sunsuit and had obviously removed it at some stage. The temperatures in the area were described as very cold, especially overnight, and it had rained multiple times too overnight. Yet somehow, 5 days later, there she is, almost completely okay, other than the scratches and sore throat. Normally in these kinds of articles, comments are made as to how much weight was lost or that the person was suffering from dehydration, but that wasn't mentioned here, interestingly enough. They mentioned the scratches and sore throat, but nothing about dehydration. It was also said that this outcome shocked local law enforcement. I'm assuming the sheriff and probably others present, but they didn't give any further statements that I could find anywhere. Given what was said before she was found, it perhaps is an indication that some of them potentially didn't believe that she was alone for her entire time spent missing. There wasn't any direct evidence to support this, however, other than the idea that she must have been kept warm somehow, but that alone isn't good enough to be throwing around accusations. Similar to Geraldine, it's not really clear what exactly happened. Did she just wander away, or was she lured? What did her time in the woods look like? How did she manage to stay warm in the face of rain and lowering temperatures? We'll never know for sure, but at least she was found and in seemingly great condition. Now, after discovering Alice's disappearance, I came across another that was similar in nature to hers that oddly occurred just months prior and not too far away. This disappearance of Winona Nelson was actually mentioned a number of times throughout the articles referring to Alice. This was generally in the form of law enforcement and searchers remarking about how they were reminded of Winona while searching for Alice. In one article on Alice, this was said: Sheriff Peck recalled that 2-year-old Winona Nelson was found under a brush pile in similar terrain last April after 4 nights spent in the open. She survived the ordeal after weeks of treatment for pneumonia at Whittinsville Hospital. So with that, let's get into the circumstances. The earliest article I could find on this was from the 26th of April, 1937. More than 200 individuals were searching the heavily wooded section of South Upton near the Upton Northbridge town line today for Winona Nelson. The little girl was last seen about 5:30 PM last night. She was playing in the yard of her home in a sand pile. About 6 PM, her parents went to get her for supper, but she had disappeared. To be clear, Winona wasn't outside alone for 30 minutes, she was with 5 other young friends. But they had ran to a nearby spring and returned to the sand pile within 5 minutes of leaving. When they returned, Winona wasn't there. Almost immediately, 2 hypotheses became vocalised. One being that she may have tried to follow the others and got lost. The other being that she may have been taken from the sand pile during that 5-minute window. The search was very similar in scale to that of Alice's disappearance, and a grid search spanning miles in each direction was organised with bloodhounds present. Bloodhounds cast through bogs and woods of South Upton Tuesday seeking trace of Winona, missing since Sunday night from her isolated home. The child's mother was puzzled by one thing. Little Winona's doll was still on the sand pile in the backyard. She never went anywhere without it, said the mother. Just reading between the lines a bit there, it seems that the family may have felt that she was taken given that statement, probably thinking that if she had simply followed the group, she'd have taken her doll with her. However, as previously established, Winona would be found after 4 days. Winona was found alive Thursday afternoon in the woods a mile and a quarter from her home. The child was found by a 14-year-old boy. She was wearing a blue sweater which had helped to protect her from the rain and cold of the last 4 days. Dr. John J. Bouvier, staff physician at the hospital, said that the child's condition was critical and it was doubtful that she would live. He said both hands were frozen and her legs up to the knees were frozen. Gangrene had set in the left foot, he said. She was suffering from starvation and exposure, he added. So right off the bat, we can see some clear differences between the two disappearances. I can see why comparisons were made between the two, but unlike Alice's condition, Winona's was certainly consistent with being out in the wilderness by herself in these particularly harsh conditions. Winona today was making a fight for life in a hospital here as astounding as her survival of 4 freezing rain-swept days and nights lost in the woods near her isolated home. 2 days ago, physicians gave her 12 hours to live in the oxygen tent where she is fighting gangrene, frozen extremities and pneumonia. After hours of watching, waiting, Dr. Bouvier announced today that Winona was rallying valiantly and that her condition was so improved that she had an excellent chance to recover. He had not reckoned with the remarkable recuperative powers within the tiny frame. Winona would go on to make a full recovery and would have surgery performed on her feet that would allow her to walk again. Winona was clearly in much worse condition than Alice, and multiple articles referred to the fact that she was suffering from starvation and dehydration, which of course was not mentioned in the reports on Alice. The reporting on each incident might highlight that there was considerable difference between the disappearances themselves. Did they both simply wander out into the woods and get lost? Did someone perhaps take Alice in the first instance and later leave her in the woods to be found? It's not clear. I'm just glad both were found in the end, and they certainly make for an interesting string of disappearances. What do you make of these incidents? David Taylor was 23 years old when he disappeared from Mount Rainier National Park. David was actually a park ranger and worked at this particular park, and over the years he worked there, he had become quite familiar with the mountain itself. He and his friend, another park ranger who he worked with, 27-year-old Carl Fabiani, made plans to ascend the mountain together. They embarked on this trip together just after mid-November in 1974, but something would go awry on the 18th. The first I heard of this disappearance was from the East Liverpool Evening Review. The search for a missing National Park ranger who disappeared while climbing Monday on Mount Rainier was scheduled to resume Thursday morning. Missing was David Taylor. Carl made his way off the mountain early Wednesday morning, the 20th. John Parks, Chief of Operations for Mount Rainier National Park, said if Taylor is unhurt, he could survive a couple more days. This is one of those massive problems faced when something goes wrong in these kinds of wilderness areas. Something had happened to David on the 18th, but it took Carl 2 more days before he was able to get down the mountain to report it. The way Carl explained how David disappeared was quite ominous. He said that as they were ascending the mountain, a whiteout had occurred. A foggy mist and snow quickly descended on the area and practically had covered all of the landmarks. He said that the two went far away from one another, about 100 feet, but as they were engulfed by the whiteout, they lost sight of one another. He went on and said that as he made his way towards David, he just couldn't find him. He was calling out to David, but he wasn't hearing a reply. A rescue party spent Wednesday night camped at the 7,500 foot level of the mountain and was scheduled to begin climbing at daybreak. Fabiani told officials that he and David became separated during the whiteout at the 9,500 foot level on Success Cleaver when visibility was lost due to blowing snow. It took 40 hours in stormy weather to climb off the treacherous Cleaver, cross 2 glaciers, and descend through the woods to safety on the west side of the mountain. Fabiani told officials that he and David had begun the summit attempt on Friday 15th, but gave it up on Sunday 17th at the 12,500 foot level because of deep, fresh snow, potential avalanches and poor visibility. Fabiani told officials that he and David were about 100 feet apart when they became separated. 100 feet is 33 yards, so they were very close together at the time of his disappearance. It's hard to imagine how they might have lost one another in that moment, given their close proximity. You'd also have expected that David would have been able to hear Carl's calls for him, but he never responded. Perhaps David panicked and accidentally fell in that moment where visibility became so bad that they couldn't see each other despite being so close. I'm not sure what else actually makes sense there. Actually, after some further reading, it also seems that Carl reasoned to himself that David must have fallen too. Carl reasoned that David must have fallen Monday as he and Carl were retreating from the long rib of volcanic rock rising from the base of Pyramid Peak. Fabiani looked for David Monday and Tuesday, then struggled back, weak and hungry to get help. He could be up there somewhere. He's resourceful, strong, well equipped with a tent and plenty of food, if only the weather would clear. The area where this took place was searched, but no trace of David could be found, and it was said that there was no evidence found of him falling, though that would presumably be because if he had have fallen, he would then have been completely covered by the snow in probably a short amount of time. Hope seemed to drain from the efforts to find him when the searchers themselves became pinned down on Mount Rainier due to another whiteout and avalanches that were occurring nearby. The park rangers weren't ready to give up though. A fresh 4-member rescue team planned to resume the search for a national park ranger missing on the mountain. Park officials said that the new crew, consisting of veteran mountaineers, was dispatched to replace the exhausted team, who had established a base camp at the 9,000 foot level. This raises another point about just how dangerous these areas can be. The searches look absolutely nothing like they do on the ground because you quite literally need experts, highly trained search teams to be able to search these areas effectively and safely, meaning that the number of searchers is always going to be extremely limited in comparison to a normal search effort. You would think that if David had have fallen, then Carl would have heard a shout or call for help or something like that, but he never did. The way it was described was that the whiteout occurred quickly and they were engulfed quickly by the fog and falling snow, which reduced visibility so much that they couldn't see one another from 30 yards away. He then made his way towards David, but he couldn't find him. So what happened in this moment? Did David have the same idea and accidentally wandered away in the wrong direction and then got lost? I can't imagine that to be the case, because that means he also didn't hear Carl's calls for him, though it was probably very noisy at the time if it was windy. In the end though, it wasn't possible to understand exactly what happened, and as far as I can tell, David nor his remains were ever found. What do you think happened here? Pearl Turner was 3 years old when she disappeared in the wilds of White Oak Mountain, located in Arkansas. Pearl was the daughter of a mountaineer farmer, and as such, they lived in a very rural area bordering wilderness on every side. It was never made clear exactly how she vanished, but from reading the articles, I get the impression that she was playing just outside of their home at the time. The story was picked up by the press a few days into the search, and we have to get bizarre almost immediately. A weary army of 800 men renewed their search efforts today to find Pearl Turner. The discovery late yesterday of footprints at a point where members of the searching party declared that they had been several times during the past 2 days, served to strengthen the belief in the idea that she'd been taken by a third party. The fact that they believed that they'd found her footprints in an area that they'd already searched multiple times perhaps is unusual enough. But what I find peculiar is the reasoning that somehow that means that she'd been taken. I'd note that again, similar to Jerry's disappearance, no other footprints were mentioned, or any evidence that would lead to the belief that she wasn't alone. So, I'm not sure how you go to finding her lone footprints in an area that they'd already searched to then saying that she'd been taken. I can see how this discovery might have confused people present, but why on earth you'd come to the conclusion that she'd been taken as opposed to thinking, oh wow, she must have just been here recently, I don't understand. Am I missing something obvious, or am I wrong in thinking this way? The group followed the footprints for 100 yards where the trail was lost. Small bands of men were then sent in all directions, but no further trace of Pearl was found. Again, similar to Jerry, the search parties fully expected to find further evidence of her presence after the footprints. Perhaps it's because they didn't that led them to believe that she'd been removed from the area. Pearl, who disappeared from her home a week ago, has baffled a group of 300 men for 5 days. The search, virtually, has been abandoned. The search didn't actually end there, but I can fully understand why the searchers expressed their confusion here. After finding the footprints, they must have thought, where in the world could she possibly be? How far could she have gotten? And despite all of their efforts, they weren't finding a single thing. The greatest human comb known to the backwoods will be drawn through the wilds of White Oak Mountain tomorrow in an effort to locate Pearl, the modern Little Red Riding Hood. Spaced at 10-foot intervals, the human line of 500 men will march into the dense woods at dawn and sweep the forest for her. Small bands of mountaineers rove the woodland in search of Pearl, but without avail. Not the slightest trace of her was found, and despair again gripped the hearts of the weary searchers as the 6th day of the hunt ended without avail. It seems at this point the authorities were becoming desperate for answers, and they went on what I can only describe as an arrest spree. The sheriff picked 5 individuals, who I suppose must have been near the general area at the time, otherwise it wouldn't make any sense, and then arrested them, stating that it would help clear up the mystery. However, after the questioning, law enforcement came to the conclusion that none of them had anything to do with this and changed their stance to the idea that she must have perished in the forest. Meanwhile, as this was going on, the weather took a turn for the worse during the search and heavy rains brought it to a crawl. These were the final words I could find on this incident. Officials in the Scott County Mountains are without a single clue as to what became of Pearl. Although hundreds of men have searched every crag and nook of the mountains. The 5 persons arrested have been released and absolved of all suspicion of having taken Pearl, and officials again incline to the belief that she has perished. The search continued for a while after this, but Pearl was never seen again. The only clue that was ever found was the little footprints that were believed to belong to her, which were discovered in an area that had already been searched multiple times. So the question remains, what happened to Pearl and where did she go? 10-year-old John Ireland disappeared while on a camping trip with his parents in Yosemite National Park on the 18th of July 1964. This disappearance was particularly unfortunate because he had quite literally gone missing within the first 10 minutes of arriving at the campsite. It's odd because John disappeared incredibly quickly here. From what I can make out, it appears as though the parents and John began exploring their surroundings together and they approached the start of a trail. There was a brook with shallow water down to the side and John went down into it while his parents were walking on the trail beside him. However, something happened in these moments and the parents realised that they couldn't actually hear John anymore, so they backed up and called for him, but there was no reply. The father then rushed down into the brook, but he was gone. The earliest article I came across was posted on the 20th, so this was the 3rd day missing at this point. Park personnel and 55 men from Castle Air Force Base today resumed their search for John, missing since Saturday, from the Hardin Lake campground. The Islands arrived at the campground Saturday morning and the boy was last seen about 11 AM. He was reported missing at 4 PM. To clarify there, when the parents realised that he was gone, they became understandably frantic and the father began dashing around in the woods trying to find him while the mother went to get help from the camp. The general feeling was that he just couldn't have gotten very far away, and with the numbers present from the camp, they'd be able to find him quickly. However, as the time went on during this makeshift search, the real panic set in when they couldn't find him. This actually astounded the people who were searching because he'd vanished so quickly. It seems that because of this, there were suspicions that he'd been taken, and as they approached that 5th hour of searching, law enforcement was made aware of the situation. I think that 5 hours might have been a little too long here. I can see why you might not report this immediately, because the general sense must have been that he can't have gone very far. All trails and stream drainages in the area were covered by foot and horseback and a helicopter flying at low elevation for several hours. 2 bloodhounds from Sacramento, sent by the Hamilton Air Force Base, left the campground yesterday and seemed to be on a promising trail along the road from Hardin Lake to White Wolf. Interestingly again here, similar to Jeff, the dogs had managed to find his scent, but it would come to an abrupt end. For 3/4 of a mile, they followed a small stream which flows into the middle fork of the Tulum River, where the trail was lost. The terrain in which the search has been continued is at an elevation of more than 7,000 feet. It is rugged and fairly open, although there is some second growth timber and brush. The dogs just stopped and sat down at one point and couldn't follow the scent any further. Now I know what you're thinking, clearly he must have fallen into the water, and I thought so too. However, park authorities said it was unlikely that the boy fell into one of the many streams in the area because they are too shallow. The dogs followed his scent for several miles from the camp until they stopped and couldn't follow any further, so John managed to get some distance away here. The search intensified from here and more volunteers came pouring in to help. The point at which the dogs followed the scent was also a central focus now, but they weren't finding a trace. About 100 men, including 50 sailors, searched every rock and cranny, every bush and clump of brush today for John, but nothing has been found. During the night, temperatures were hovering around freezing, and John was only wearing light clothing without a coat. There was also mention about the search being reduced in scale at this point, and it comes across as though people believe that he was gone, either taken or had passed away somewhere in the forest. I think that the dogs, being unable to follow the scent, was pushing the belief that he may have been taken by someone. Although reading further, there is some conflicting information on that. Suggestions that the boy may have been harmed by snakes or bears were discounted. Officials have considered the possibility that John wandered as far as the Tioga Road, 4 miles south, and was picked up by a motorist, but this was considered unlikely. Streams and lakes in the area are too shallow to be dangerous, rangers said. The searching parties will be reduced Saturday if no clues show up. This is quite revealing because what's being said is that there was no evidence that animal predation had occurred, and they were saying it's unlikely that he was taken by a motorist because they didn't think he'd make it 4 miles away. Now, because they were also saying that if nothing is found in the following days that they were going to scale back the search, this somewhat implies that the general feeling may have been that he had succumbed to exposure inside the forest, and it was very unlikely that they were going to be able to find him in good condition. However, John was found Saturday by 2 rangers after being missing for 1 week in a lonely, remote area of Yosemite National Park. The discovery came as a massive search was being disbanded and the rangers were heading back to their camp. Rangers Gil Hall and Jim Riley found the youngster only 3 miles from the Hardin Lake campsite, 7,000 feet up near Tulum Meadow, from which he had wandered. "It's amazing," said one doctor. "He ate nothing but water. The boy is talking, you'd hardly know he'd taken a hike." John said, "I was going exploring down the creek and then I got lost. I found another road, but it was a different road. Unfortunately, that was pretty much the end of the paper trail. As is often the case in some of these disappearances, medical professionals were taken aback by John's condition because it was far better than was anticipated. Plus, it also appears that many thought he wasn't coming back. There were suspicions that John might not have been alone for the entire time, but they went silent after he was examined and treated. And of course, John never said anything about anyone else being there. I always find it so bizarre how people manage to disappear so quickly without a trace. Teddy Thompson was 4 years old when he disappeared from a rural area of California at the end of January in 1938. Specifically, Teddy lived with his parents between 10 and 15 miles north of Covelo, in an area bordering the Mendocino National Forest. The first I heard of Teddy was while scouring older newspapers, and I found this reported by the Edwardsville Intelligencer on the 1st of February 1938. Native American trackers and manhunting dogs were employed today in the search for Teddy, who strayed from home into the mountains Saturday afternoon, leaving a trail of bare footprints that ceased where they crossed those of a large mountain lion. Now, I know what you're thinking, case closed. Well, the sheriff and some of the trackers working under him didn't think so. Sheriff E.L. Williams announced today he was investigating the possibility that 4-year-old Teddy Thompson, missing for 3 days in the Mendocino Mountains near Covelo, was the victim of foul play. I am not satisfied with the theory that the boy merely wandered away from home, or that he was the victim of a wild animal, said Sheriff Williams. So the gist of this is that there were trackers present who were of the opinion that the mountain lion tracks had been made much earlier than Teddy's, meaning that it was his belief that the two had not crossed paths. The sheriff seems to have taken that position too. Now, whether that was just trying to come from a place of hope, or whether the trackers were actually correct is unclear, but that was the position of some present. There were 200 men in the search, including several Native Americans of the Round Valley Reservation who were more familiar than the woodsmen with the mountain trails and the ways of the wild animals that frequent them. The prints of the lion and the barefoot boy ran parallel for a short ways. Then they met and the boy's trail ended. The lion tracks continued into the wilderness. I'm not sure what other possibility there was here. The tracks go parallel with one another, then Teddy's come to an abrupt end while the lines continue. I think that some of the confusion came from the fact that there was no visible evidence of an attack. There was nothing present on the ground to insinuate a bite or something like that. I get the impression that they were expecting to find a trace of Teddy here somewhere along these tracks, but they didn't. Deputy Sheriff C.H. Lavelle had a conversation with the Native American trackers and relayed some information to the press. To condense it, it was stated that it's hard to believe that the lion would have attacked Teddy, saying that the lions were not hard pressed for food in the area as there were many deer and other game. They also stated that while unpredictable, the lions usually run away at the first scent of a human or dog. Search dogs were brought in who were given Teddy's scent, but they couldn't find it anywhere in the area. Alongside the dogs, over 200 men combed the area using grid searches, but they too found nothing. Unfortunately, the weather began to worsen too, which made the search much more difficult. The article then also gave us some vague details as to the moment of disappearance. Teddy's father, Charles, said, Teddy wandered out to play Saturday afternoon with 2 of the children. That evening, when he did not return, his father called for help at the ranger station across the river. It wasn't stated if Teddy made it to his friends or not, so it's not made clear in the paper if he disappeared before he met up with them or after he left them to go home. Whatever the case may be though, the deputy sheriff also stated this: it would have been impossible to stay alive 3 days under present weather conditions. Snow fell in this area today, covering both the footprints of the boy found near his parents' cabin and the parallel tracks of a mountain lion. Faint hope that Teddy is still alive was abandoned today by searchers. The boy was lightly clad when he vanished. I feel certain he perished in the bitter cold of the past 4 days. we will find his body sooner or later. The sheriff is investigating a theory of foul play, but would not reveal the basis for his belief. Okay, so the only other possible outcome here, including a third party that wasn't the lion, has to be something along these lines. If it's true that the mountain lion tracks were made at a much earlier time, that means that when Teddy approached the tracks, someone else took him and knew that the tracks converging in such a way would make it look like he was taken by the lion. I'm not sure how likely something like that actually is, but that seems to be the only basis I can see for the foul play hypothesis. There were never any other tracks made by a person mentioned though. Interestingly enough anyway, the mountain lion attack and foul play hypotheses both seem to have been disregarded in the end by the authorities. Sheriff Williams discarded a previous theory of the possibility of foul play. The sheriff returned from a wilderness search Wednesday night convinced that Teddy had wandered off into the wilderness where he would succumb to the elements. Williams went into the mountain wilderness to investigate the foul play possibility. When he got back to his office here, after a battle with storm conditions, he said there was nothing to the reports. Under the sheriff's direction, 2 deep wells around the Thompson cabin were searched without finding a trace of the missing boy. The sheriff was convinced that the child had run away from his home Saturday afternoon and had become lost in the thick brush of the area. Clad only in a sweater and overalls, barefooted, Teddy probably perished of exposure. I know that a lot of people are going to think that law enforcement were crazy here for seeming to discard the lion attack hypothesis, but if the information they were working with was that the tracks were made at different times, then you can see why perhaps they thought he'd walked away. However, realistically, that's hardly without its problems either, because then you have to ask, well, why did Teddy's tracks come to an abrupt end? If not the lion, what else caused them to stop? If someone else was there that took him at that moment, why did the perpetrator leave no tracks himself? Unfortunately, the weather worsened again for the second time during the search. A severe storm today blocked further search for Teddy. A group of more than 150 men who had been looking for the boy scattered. Snowdrifts and slides blocked the mountain roads and trails, and held a pack of lion hunting dogs at Covelo, which were to have been taken to the wilderness. The final word on this, at least from what I can find, came on the 9th of February 1938, around 2 weeks after his disappearance. After all of the wild clues of being taken and third-party involvement, and other lurid tales that have been pursued with attendant delay, metropolitan newspapermen who were sent in on the case suggested there was a possibility Teddy might have fallen into the stream running through the property of the Thompsons, and the waters at flood stage might have carried the body of the little boy downstream. This conclusion was, in the end, finally gone into carefully, and the celluloid ball with which little Teddy used to amuse himself, and with which he had with him when he was last seen, was found near the stream bank, and then, to add additional weight to the theory, the child may have fallen into the stream. A number of shreds of wool, matching the material in the sweater the little fellow had on the afternoon he disappeared from sight, were picked off a bush a short distance from where the boy's ball was picked up. I almost ended the segment on Teddy there, thinking that was the end of the paper trail, but after going through everything again, I found further articles at the end of March, 2 months after he disappeared. 2 months ago, Teddy Thompson vanished from his mountain cabin home under circumstances which produced one of the greatest hunts in the history of this area. Monday, his body was found in the mountains where he perished. The body was found yesterday 2 miles from his home and within 20 feet of territory covered by the searching parties. 20 feet is 6 yards, so they were basically right on top of him during the search, which I suppose technically means that he was found in an area that had already been searched. Now, upon discovery, there was clear evidence of animal predation, but after examining the remains, it was felt that this predation had occurred after his passing. The sheriff and officers present were convinced that young Teddy had passed away due to freezing. Constable Charles Lavelle said he was convinced Teddy had passed away due to freezing and was not carried off by a lion. In the end, I suppose no one will ever truly know what happened to Teddy, and I'd like to hear your closing thoughts on this one too. What happened here? Do you think Teddy was taken by a mountain lion? Was it some other kind of third party? Was it down to exposure? It seems that we can be confident in discounting the falling into a body of water hypothesis. Personally, I was leaning towards the mountain lion because I'm not sure why the tracks would just suddenly stop. But if the tracks weren't made at the same time, then I just don't know. This one is a shorter disappearance, and there is very little information about Donald McFarlane, who disappeared from the Scottish mining district of Ben Har in 1895. Unfortunately, not even his age was given, but what we do know is that Donald was a veteran miner and was highly familiar with Ben Har, having worked there for a long time. He disappeared from the area one day, but none of the other miners had seen him leave. When work finished that day, it was realised that Donald hadn't been counted for, and a search of the immediate area was organised by his friends and co-workers. They didn't find anything that would indicate a direction of travel or what had even happened to him. An older man named Robert Halbert, who was from a small town not too far away, was thought of by the locals of possessing something called second sight, in that, for whatever reason, it's not clear why they thought this, but they believed he had the ability to see things that others could not. I quote, "There was no trace of Donald after a 2-day search. On Tuesday, Robert Halbert, an old man who has the reputation of possessing second sight, and who is a brother-in-law of McFarlane, fell asleep and dreamed that he saw the missing man in a particular part of Almond Water, which is some miles distant. Mentioning this to the neighbours, they went to the place, saw the footprints of the missing man in the snow, and eventually found the man himself standing in the water, which is 3 feet deep with ice frozen around him. He had passed." What was interesting about this is that no one had a single clue as to what happened. Donald hadn't been injured, and no one had seen him leave that day. To me, it seems awfully suspicious that Donald's brother-in-law, who had supposed second sight, knew exactly where he was. Though of course we have no context as to why people believed that he had second sight, or what they were calling second sight. Having said that though, if it didn't appear as though Donald was injured, I'm not sure what you can do with that. That was pretty much the end of the paper trail too, so I suppose now is a good time to end this video and to hand it over to you in the comments below. I'd just like to take the time to thank you for watching, and a big thank you to the patrons who've been running around and disappearing on the screen. If you found the video interesting, then please do leave a like, hit the bell and subscribe if you haven't already. It helps me a lot. And if not, then feel free to leave a dislike. I'm just looking for your honest opinion either way. I hope that you've had a